According to sources close to Middle Eastern analytical centers and Western intelligence structures, the situation around Iran continues to heat up rapidly and is increasingly described as being in a pre-war phase. The US, according to insiders, is deploying forces to the region on an unprecedented scale, strengthening air groups, naval presence, and missile defense elements, which in classified reports is interpreted as preparation for a possible strike on the Iranian regime, which, according to a number of experts, is living out its final days. Inside Iran itself, protests continue, covering almost all social groups, from students and workers to representatives of the middle class and parts of regional elites. These demonstrations are unfolding against the backdrop of a catastrophic economic downturn, a sharp decline in living standards, the devaluation of the national currency, and the effective paralysis of entire sectors of the economy. Analysts note that with each passing day, the regime has fewer and fewer tools to stabilize the situation, while the use of force to suppress protests only deepens the internal crisis. That is why the expert community increasingly voices the view that if the US truly plans to strike Iran, it must do so in the very near future, while the regime is maximally weakened by internal turmoil. Some analysts go even further and argue that Washington has already missed the optimal moment for an attack. The reason for this, they say, is that Iran is no longer facing Western pressure alone in this confrontation. It is being actively supported by China, and this support is not symbolic diplomatic backing, but systematic and large-scale military and technological assistance. According to classified sources, Beijing is increasing deliveries of weapons and military equipment at a pace not seen in the region for many years, helping Iran strengthen air defense, detection systems, electronic warfare capabilities, and logistical infrastructure. In effect, insiders claim China is methodically preparing Iran for a possible military clash with the US, and with each passing day, the volume of resources and forces accumulated to repel a potential attack continues to grow. China's key interest in this situation is purely pragmatic and primarily linked to the resource base. Iran remains one of the most important suppliers of cheap oil for the Chinese economy, and a significant share of China's imported energy resources comes precisely from the Iranian direction, including through complex and opaque schemes that allow sanctions restrictions to be bypassed. The loss of this source would be a serious blow for China, capable of affecting the country's energy security and the pace of its economic growth. In addition, Iran is viewed in Beijing as China's main ally in the Middle East, a foothold through which influence is built in a resource-rich region with strategically important transport routes. That is why, according to experts, China cannot afford the collapse of the Iranian regime under US strikes and is ready to invest in its stability without entering into a direct military confrontation with Washington. As a result, the world has found itself in a situation where further developments depend simultaneously on several factors: Donald Trump's determination to move from a show of force to a real attack, the ability of the Iranian regime to withstand an external strike amid an internal crisis, and the scale of Chinese support, which may play a decisive role in this confrontation. Increasingly, the conclusion is being voiced that this is no longer a question of if, but a question of time, the time until a possible strike, and the time that will show whether Iran becomes another example of a rapid regime collapse or turns into a protracted knot of global confrontation whose consequences will be felt by the entire world. Against this backdrop, closed strategic assessments increasingly emphasize that a possible operation against Iran is ceasing to be a local decision and is turning into a nodal moment of global politics as a whole. According to sources familiar with internal discussions within the Pentagon and the US National Security Council, the American military is considering several strike scenarios at once, ranging from a limited campaign using precision weapons to more large-scale pressure aimed at the complete destruction of the regime's military infrastructure. However, each of these scenarios is accompanied by increasingly troubling calculations related to Iranian retaliatory actions and the indirect involvement of other players. Iran, according to analysts' assessments, has significantly increased its capacity for an asymmetric response in recent months, including strikes on US bases in the region, actions through allied groups, and the potential destabilization of key transport arteries, above all the Strait of Hormuz. It is precisely here, as sources emphasize, that Chinese support acquires special significance. Beijing, according to insiders, is helping Tehran not only with weapons, but also with strategic planning, sharing experience in confronting a technologically superior adversary and building a multi-layered defense. This refers to a concept of attrition, under which even the stronger side becomes drawn into a prolonged conflict without a clear finale. In Washington, there is an understanding that such a scenario could lead to a sharp rise in energy prices, a blow to the global economy, and the strengthening of anti-American sentiment in the region, which in the long term would benefit China in particular. In expert circles, the idea is increasingly voiced that Beijing is effectively interested in placing the US before a difficult choice with no good options: either abandon the strike and demonstrate weakness, or launch an operation that risks evolving into a prolonged confrontation. At the same time, pressure is intensifying within the US itself. According to sociological polls and leaks from political headquarters, American society is tired of endless conflicts in the Middle East and is increasingly unwilling to support a new military campaign, especially against the backdrop of domestic economic and social problems. This creates an additional factor of uncertainty for the Trump administration, which is forced to take into account not only foreign policy calculations, but also domestic reactions. Meanwhile, in Iran, the regime, despite the harsh suppression of protests, is trying to buy time, counting on the external threat to temporarily consolidate part of society and the elites. However, analysts agree that this is only a postponement, not a solution to the problem. Even if the regime manages to survive a possible strike, the country will emerge from this crisis deeply weakened and even more dependent on external partners, above all China. In this sense, Beijing may turn out to be the main beneficiary of any outcome. Either it preserves an ally and a source of resources, or it gains an even more dependent partner, forced to pay for support with access to strategic assets and influence in the region. All this turns the situation around Iran into one of the key tests of the new global reality, where local conflicts become part of a larger game between centers of power. And the longer uncertainty persists, the higher the risk that any decision, or its absence, will lead to consequences that go far beyond the Middle East and shape the balance of power for years ahead. The situation around Iran is increasingly shifting into a state of prolonged strategic waiting, in which none of the sides is ready to be the first to assume responsibility for an irreversible step. Decisions are postponed, signals are deliberately kept ambiguous, and pressure grows not through direct confrontation, but through the accumulation of risks and the consistent narrowing of room for maneuver. At the same time, each new element of military or political pressure does not bring a resolution closer, but only raises the price of a future decision. In such a configuration, the conflict may not begin suddenly, but it is no longer capable of ending on its own either, remaining a permanent factor of instability both for the region and for the global system as a whole.